Today, I want to discuss the concept of tithing with you. It's important to understand that God is not limited in resources. He possesses everything. His economic system is a doctrine where we are called to share our resources. The more we give, the more we will receive. God's multiplication is not percentile-based. It's multiplicative. In the Old Testament, even before the Mosaic Law, approximately 425 years before it, Abraham gave the first tithe. He voluntarily gave a tithe to Melchizedek, a priest of God, Genesis 14:20. This tithe was not tied to his annual income, but was based on what he had conquered. Jacob was the second to tithe, Genesis 28:2. He did so voluntarily, promising the Lord that regardless of what he received, he would give back 10%. Later in the law, the tithe was formally established. The Israelites primarily lived off agriculture, and it was often mentioned that they should bring a tithe of their produce. The law specified what should be tithed, as seen in Exodus 22:29 and Deuteronomy 14:22. Livestock also fell under the tithing system, Leviticus 27:31-32. Tithes could also be redeemed. If someone didn't want to give up an animal but wanted to redeem it, they had to add an additional 20% to its value, Deuteronomy 14:24. Tithing served to support the priests and Levites, Numbers 18:21-28. The king was entitled to a portion of the tithe as well, 1 Samuel 8:15. Even the Levites themselves were required to give a tithe, Numbers 18:26-27. There were tithes associated with festivals as well, Deuteronomy 12:17, 18, 14:26-27. In summary, the concept of tithing in the Bible was not only a practice of giving back to God, but also served as a means to support religious leaders, the Levites, and the celebration of religious festivals. Tithes were given for priests and Levites, Numbers 18:21-28. Tithes were also given to the Lord, Deuteronomy 12:6, 7, 17, 18. Additionally, tithes were allocated for the poor and strangers every 3 years, Deuteronomy 14:27-28. When you consider all these contributions, it amounted to 23% every year. There were other voluntary offerings, such as gifts for the overseer, Genesis 43:11. Redemption money for souls, Exodus 30:11-16. Property taxes were Samuel 17:25. First fruits, Exodus 23:19. And thanksgiving offerings, Leviticus 22:21-29. Every 7th year, people were not allowed to work their fields, and they had to trust that the Lord would provide for their households despite not working. God promised abundant blessings to those who generously and wholeheartedly gave, Malachi 3:10-12. In the New Testament, during the time of Jesus, there were also government taxes, Matthew 22:17-22. The redemption money for souls existed in the New Testament as well, Matthew 17:24. Tithes were given to priests and Levites in the New Testament, and Jesus did not abolish this practice, Matthew 23:23, Luke 18:12. Taxes were imposed on the Jewish people, but it's important to note that God's children were considered free and not slaves, Matthew 17:24-26. When Zacchaeus, a newly converted individual, encountered Jesus, he was willing to give half of his possessions to the poor, Luke 19:8. Jesus famously encouraged a rich young man to sell all his possessions and give to the poor, Matthew 19:21. Jesus praised the act of a poor widow who gave all she had, Mark 12:42-44. In the early Christian community, believers shared their possessions, Acts 4:34-35. The rights of those who preached the gospel were also recognized, 1 Corinthians 9:12-14. The way collections were handled did not strictly adhere to the Old Testament law, 1 Corinthians 16:1-4. The collection of offerings was intended to support the poor, as mentioned in Galatians 2:10. Apostle Paul encouraged voluntary and cheerful giving, as emphasized in 2 Corinthians 9:6-7. Throughout the New Testament, we do not find a specific command from Jesus to tithe, but he also did not declare it as something negative. In the New Testament, there are instances where people gave even more than a tithe, and the principle is that the more we give, the more blessings we receive. In summary, the Old Testament tithe was associated with the temple and sacrificial offerings, which are not applicable today. Everything culminated with the sacrifice of Jesus, signifying our freedom from such sacrifices. However, there is a precedent for voluntary giving, as seen with Abraham and Jacob before the establishment of the Mosaic law. In the history of Christianity, there is no specific mention of a tithe collection in the New Testament. The concept of tithing is first recorded in the 3rd century, with references to tithing by Cyprian and Origen. The practice of tithing became more formalized when Pope John Damascene introduced it as a decree. Around the 7th century, Spanish and Galilean documents began mentioning punishments for those who did not pay a tithe, indicating its enforcement. Predecessors of Charlemagne in the 7th century introduced a tithe collection, and it was codified into secular law, where failure to pay the tithe could lead to confiscation of property. Even during the Crusades, the Church continued to collect tithes. During the Reformation, many reformers embraced and upheld these rules, and in Germany, tithing was abolished by law in 1848. Today, only a church tax of 7 to 8% remains if you are a member of a state church. Tithing serves as a way to express gratitude to the Lord for salvation, for His provision, and for His guidance in one's life. Some have suggested that if everyone contributed just 10% to the church, our congregations would never face financial difficulties and could fully support their ministers. Many New Testament texts echo and, at times, directly quote crucial ideas expressed in the Old Testament, emphasizing the continuity of key principles between the two. Now, there's a significant passage that, in my understanding, should help shape the right financial habits for each of us. Let's read together 1 Timothy 5:8. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. In this verse, Paul emphasizes the seriousness of the wrongdoing committed by those who do not take care of their own family, particularly those in their own household. He refers to such behavior as a denial of faith. Christian faith continually asserts that all true believers should care for one another. By neglecting this responsibility, a Christian's actions are seen as a rejection of the truths taught by Christianity. Such a person is considered worse than an unbeliever, because many unbelievers often display touching care for their family members. Furthermore, such a believer's actions can bring shame upon the name of the Lord, something an unbeliever may not do. In the Bible, household refers to close relatives. You can see that when it comes to one's household, meaning immediate family members with whom we live under one roof, the absence of care is considered far worse than even unbelief or denying one's faith altogether. This underscores the priority of caring for close family members over religious rituals. As mentioned in Mark 12:33, and to love Him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself, is more than all whole, burnt offerings and sacrifices. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Galatians 6:10. You've raised an important point about the prioritization of care within the context of the Bible's teachings. While the Bible emphasizes the importance of caring for fellow believers, it also teaches us to love our enemies and do good to all people, as highlighted in Matthew 5:44. In situations where you must choose between helping a fellow believer and someone who may not share your faith or even be considered an enemy, the Bible does not make specific distinctions. Instead, it encourages us to respond to the immediate needs of those who come before us. The principle is to extend assistance to the person who is in greater proximity or need, regardless of their relationship or faith background. In essence, the message is not to walk past a person in need, even if they may be an enemy, in favor of helping a friend in a similar situation. The overarching principle is one of compassion, kindness, and the readiness to help anyone in need, regardless of their relationship with us or their faith affiliation. You've touched upon a crucial aspect of the New Testament, which underscores the importance of relationships between generations as a subset of relationships between people in general. In line with the broader teachings of the New Testament, followers of Jesus Christ are called to love their neighbors, including their own families. The Lord Jesus Christ himself, as highlighted in the Gospels, subjected himself to the authority of his pure mother and his named father, Joseph, during his childhood. Later, on multiple occasions, he referred to the words of the prophet Micah, emphasizing that one's relationship with God is fundamentally important for all human interactions. Because of this, one's faith and commitment to God can sometimes lead to division, even among family members. The Lord referred to his disciples as his family, giving spiritual significance to these familial bonds. Notably, the parable of the prodigal son holds a special place in Jesus' teachings, where he, much like the earlier prophet Isaiah, speaks about the parallels between one's relationship with God and one's relationship with parents. These teachings emphasize the profound spiritual dimension that underlies all human relationships, including those within families. They remind us that our faith and our relationship with God should inform and enhance our interactions with our relatives and fellow human beings, ultimately fostering a deeper sense of love, compassion, and understanding. The example of love and compassion that unites parents and children for all time is the sorrow of the Most Holy Mother at the foot of the cross. So first comes caring for our parents and our families, followed by tithing. The challenge of giving a tithe often arises when a person has more money. In addition to tithing, God teaches us to help those in need. We should not only focus on the need but also be guided by God's prompting. The Lord should direct where, when, and how much to give. Before making a donation, hold the money in your hand until it becomes moist. This is a moment to reflect on whether this is what the Lord wants from you. God is the ultimate giver, the most generous giver in the universe, and He wants you to learn to be more like Him. That's why you're here, to become more like Christ. Follow God's example in your giving, and He will shape your character. At the same time, when we give generously, our giving should always be a result of our relationship with God, not a means to earn it. We don't give money to obtain God's love. We give because we are already loved by Him. We have received grace through faith, so we give generously out of faith. Our giving is not for the purpose of receiving double or triple in return. We give freely, expecting nothing in return except the glorification of God. New Testament giving is voluntary and joyful. 2 Corinthians 9:7, it becomes a habitual way of life. 1 Corinthians 16:2, it's proportionate to our abilities. 2 Corinthians 8:3, generous. 2 Corinthians 8:2-3, 1 Timothy 6:18, and sacrificial. Mark 12:42-44, Acts 4:32, 2 Corinthians 8:3. The amount you should give is a matter of personal conviction before God. Pray for wisdom, study His Word, and act in faith as God leads you through His Spirit within the context of your local church community.